Our gospel reading this morning comes from the book of Mark, chapter 5, verses 21 to 43. Listen now for the word of God to you and to me. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue, named Jairus, came, and when he saw him, fell at Jesus' feet and pleaded with him repeatedly. "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be well and live." So he went with him. And a large crowd followed Jesus and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from a flow of blood for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had and was no better, but rather grew worse. She'd heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, for she said, "If I but touch his cloak, I will be made well." Immediately, her flow of blood stopped, and she felt as if her body, that she were healed of her disease. And immediately, aware that power had gone out from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my cloak?" And his disciples said, "You see that there was a crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing that what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, and fell down before Jesus and told him the whole truth. And Jesus said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, some people came from the synagogue leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the synagogue leader, "Do not be afraid, only believe." And Jesus allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. And when they came to the synagogue leader's house, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. And when Jesus entered, he said to them, "Why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. Then he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, "Talitha kum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl stood up and began to walk about. She was about 12 years old. At this time they were overcome with amazement, and Jesus strictly ordered them that no one should know this and told them to give her something to eat. Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So summer worship is a little bit more informal, and though I had dozens and dozens of awful ideas race through my head, I decided to settle on one. And that idea is going to require all of you some participation throughout the sermon. So I'm going to be able to tell if you're paying attention or not. So throughout the sermon, I'm going to say a phrase, and you all are going to repeat it, a little call and response. So stay with me here. What you all are going to say is interruptions are the work. Interruptions are the work. Okay, let's try that. 1, 2, 3. Interruptions are the work. Wonderful. So you all will say that after I start a phrase. And the phrase I'm going to say is "for faith, for hope, for recovery of the soul." And then you all say interruptions are the work. So let's put it all together. Is everyone ready? Great. So I'm going to say, "for faith, for hope, for recovery of the soul." Interruptions are the work. For faith, for hope, for recovery of the soul. Interruptions are the work. Beautiful. Easy breezy, beautiful. So stay on your toes. Every time that Gretchen reads my bio here, which seems to be increasingly frequent, she reads my job title at Catonsville Presbyterian Church. And that job title is a mouthful. It's Communications and Operations Manager, and we have to use an acronym for it. So what's fun about the position is that it takes this weird mix of my pastoral skills and my administrative, my operational skills, and mixes it all together. And what's fun about it is that people also tell me things that they wouldn't tell the pastors. So I'm physically in the church office 4 days a week, Tuesday through Friday. And I never really know who or what is going to walk through the door. And some days, there's no foot traffic. It's just empty, quiet as a mouse. And on those days, it's just me and the accountant for the church. And I have to be honest, we get stuff done. We could move mountains because of how productive we are on those days. On other days that are just as fun, it's when the church is just buzzing with excitement, when people are coming in and there's just doors opening left and right. And on those days, I just accept that I'm probably not going to get much done for the day. And that's fine, that's fun. The days that aren't so fun are when it's quiet, the day's just getting started, I'm getting into a groove with things, and I'm just kicking butt. And right as I'm getting to the crest of an obstacle, right when I'm making some really serious headway, the phone rings, or someone comes in the door, or someone brings an armful of paperwork and humps it and throws it onto my desk. And those are the days that can be really, really frustrating. Because, poof, back to square one. I lose my focus, I lose my concentration, and I feel like my work is fruitless. Ugh. Henry Nouwen felt some similar frustrations. He felt those days where his vocation seemed to be split between what he really wanted to do, the real ministry, and the things that distracted him, the paperwork, the emails, the phone calls. And Henry was a Dutch priest who was this very, very complicated man, but his inner life was rich, it was beautiful, it was intimate. And fortunately for us, he constantly wrote about all of those things that he was dealing with and grappling with and reflecting on, all of those experiences in his inner life. And so Henry, as he felt frustrated by all of these interruptions left and right, pulling him away from what he felt was real ministry, he ended up penning these following words. Henry said this: I've always been complaining that my work was constantly interrupted. And then I realized that interruptions were my work. Henry realized that for faith, for hope, for recovery of the soul, interruptions are the work. Sometimes those phone calls I take are unexpectedly intimate. Sometimes the armful of paperwork is a chance for someone to leave the house that day and get a little bit of social interaction. Sometimes an urgent email is the only way that someone can express their deep, complicated feelings, but they don't know how to say it and they don't want to say it out loud. In all of those things, faith, hope, recovery of the soul, interruptions are the work. So today we have a story that is all about interruptions. They're just everywhere. So let's start with the most obvious one. Every gospel account, it has its own personal flavor to it, its own idiosyncrasies. In the Gospel of Matthew, it's the Jewish cultural nuances and the identity of Jesus as the Messiah. In the Gospel of John, there's this mysticism from the Johannine communities. And in the Gospel of Luke, it's focused all about historical record and narrative. And so Mark is just like those. It has its own flavor, its own idiosyncrasies, its own character to it. And in the Gospel of Mark, one of my favorite ones, they're called Markan sandwiches. And this is when the Gospel starts by telling one story, like Jairus coming to Jesus' feet and pleading with him, and then it shifts to another one, like this woman coming to Jesus and touching the cloak of his garment, and then it comes back, it goes all the way back to that first story and finishes it up after that second one. So it's kind of a bun, a piece of meat, and then bun. And in this, Unlike sandwiches, where the bread is a delivery system for what's inside, in Mark, it's all taken together. You can't separate any parts of it. They're equally important, and they bring meaning and connection throughout that whole unit. So, in this case, that's the very first interruption. We start with Jairus, we move to this woman who is healed, and then we return to Jairus and his daughter. So Jesus hears Jairus pleading and has pity on him, because Jairus, when he approaches Jesus, is a husk of a person. Jairus is coming face to face that his power, his privilege, his status, his education, his wealth, all of those things that have kept him safe from suffering, they're not able to keep him safe this time. None of it can save his daughter. And the person he loves most in the world is dying before him, and he can't do anything about it but watch it. He's powerless to stop it. So Jesus hears Jairus' words about his daughter and her suffering, and Jesus goes to that young woman. It's life or death. And we have to imagine the energy that's picking up as Jairus says all of these things, the urgency, the terror, the hurried movement with everyone deeply concerned for this young woman. It's just everything kicking off. It's an emergency in the tunnel vision that we get. And so this anonymous woman, the one who's been suffering for 12 years, she gets in the way. She interrupts. She becomes so disruptive that Jesus stops in his tracks. Who touched me? You can feel the energy shift in that moment, where all the eyes start turning around and everyone's attention fixes on this woman. And yet Jesus doesn't rebuke her. Jesus does something profoundly beautiful. He says, "Daughter, your faith has made you well." He names her not in some abstract or generic way, but he uses a term of intimacy, of familial connection, of daughter. In that deep, profound word, Jesus doesn't use it often. But what else does Jesus say? Your faith has made you well. This precedes any mention that this woman's disease is cured. It's only after Jesus says, your faith has made you well, that any mention of her physical curing. So Jesus, in this, shows us something unique, what begs the point, that faith is not what cures the hemorrhaging woman's body, it's what makes her well. Throughout the gospel, Jesus repeatedly cures people of diseases, and he never connects it to their faith or their belief or their spirituality or their formation or education. And so what this gospel writer might be suggesting instead is that faith is what brought this woman to Jesus. Faith is what propelled this woman's actions and what made her unshakably captive to Jesus' hope. It's that faith that compelled her, that brings her into new life. And so she is cured, yes, but that wasn't what brought wholeness to her life. It was her tenacity and her bravery to interrupt Jesus, her desire to interrupt the narratives about her body and her family and her life. She was brave enough to risk her self-understanding and the expectations of the future. So what did this woman know? For faith, for hope, for recovery of the soul, interruptions are the word. In this moment, Jesus shows us something else. In this moment where Jesus makes the interruptions his work, we come to know that God wastes nothing. Nothing is let go to waste. Nothing perishes into the void. Nothing disappears untouched by God's grace. Jesus doesn't let this woman go unnoticed or unnamed. And so this interruption, what his disciples and the crowds may have considered insignificant, God fashions into grace. This woman's small act that may have felt too small to matter or too meaningless to make a difference, God didn't let it go to waste. This woman was made well from the fleeting touch of a dirty part of a thin hem of a garment. God fashioned it into grace. Throughout the scriptures, We come to know that God lets no interruption go to waste. It is Esther who interrupts King Ahasuerus, ending a plot to destroy her people in the conception of Jesus. It is a weak, insignificant, disenfranchised Mary who cast down the mighty, interrupting the despair of God's people and the powers of this world. It is the day of Pentecost and the resurrection of Jesus which bring new things into the world and which interrupt the uninterrupted chain of despair and death and loneliness. And so all of these things, in ways great and small, especially small, we join the ministry of God's people throughout time and space in interrupting all that's wrong, all that's unjust, all that is longing for wholeness, even if it's been a dozen years of bleeding, even if there's no end in sight and no reason to expect otherwise. Because for faith, for hope, for recovery of the soul, interruptions are the work. After this woman's interruption, we get to the final part of the Markan sandwich. It's that flat bottom bun. Jesus arrives at Jairus' home, and even though there seems to be no point, Jesus, it seems, is not going to be performing a healing today because there's no one to heal. The gospel writers recount that there is wailing and weeping and crying and loud expressions of grief and sorrow. Jairus, his family, everyone who knew and who loved this little girl, they're now forced to imagine the unimaginable. Whatever expectations they had for Jesus, they were pointless now. But Jesus, without seeming to think twice, he goes and he resurrects this girl. And there's no earthquake, there's no thunder and lightning, there's no roaring winds. Jesus just shows up and helps her up out of bed. Despite this seeming simplicity of this act, the girl almost missed an encounter with God. As Jesus and Jairus are going to her home, they were told it was hopeless, it was fruitless, she died. Don't even bother. But the question for us is whether we will let God interrupt us. Will we open ourselves to the interruptions in our expectations, in our hopes, in what we believe about ourselves and our churches and our country and our neighbors? The biggest barrier to pastoral care isn't that pastors don't want to provide it. It's that people don't want to interrupt their pastors from the real ministry. It's that people feel more comfortable telling administrators and music ministers their problems than their pastors. And I think part of the problem is that we also don't want our lives to be interrupted by God. We don't want to see uncomfortable truths or have visions of the future tossed out the window. We often struggle to accept God's love and hope because we've been so hurt for so long that we don't know any other way. But for faith, for hope, for recovery of the soul, interruptions are the word. If we pull the camera back from this gospel reading, we find that we're asked to both interrupt the trouble of this world and we're asked to be interrupted by God ourselves. Every single person in this room has a sermon in their pocket about something that they care about. It might be about food insecurity, the right to have free and safe housing, or maybe it's smaller, like ministry with youth or accessibility for our buildings. Mine right now is about apathy and ministry and in faith communities. But I would wager, regardless of who you are, that you have a sermon in your pocket. I can't answer today what this encounter with Jesus means. All that I can say is that for faith, for hope, for recovery of the soul, interruptions are the work. Spend time figuring out what God is trying to interrupt in your life. What is the merry-go-round of hurt? What's the merry-go-round of assumptions or fear that is longing for Jesus to interrupt? Talk to your therapist. Talk to your spiritual director. Talk to your pastor, your friend, or your colleague. Because for faith, for hope, for recovery of the soul, interruptions are the word. Look around at the world and ask yourself, what sermon is in your pocket? Pull that sermon out and peer at it through the world. What is God calling you to interrupt? What injustices are holding this planet back from God's love? What conversations are needed to interrupt bias or social scripts or structural obstacles? And how can you pull on that hem of Jesus' garment, reaching out in courage? Because for faith, for hope, for recovery of the soul, interruptions are the work. Now go and do so. Amen.